Greenland, the icy and pristine land, is now burning like a ticking time bomb. In August 2019, Donald Trump fired the first shot by publicly requesting to purchase Greenland, a territory of Denmark, America's close NATO ally. "We can get Greenland easily, or we can get it the hard way," Trump declared boldly, shocking the entire world. This was not just an unreasonable request, but a blatant challenge to Denmark and NATO, shaking the relations between Western powers like a violent wave. Denmark responded immediately and strongly. Prime Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen not only voiced opposition, but also issued a stern warning. If the US does this, it will be the end of NATO. This was no ordinary warning, but a wake-up call to all NATO allies. NATO would cease to exist if the US dared to confront another member nation. The inviolable principles that the military alliance had been built on for 70 years are now being severely tested. Now NATO faces an unprecedented division. Can the US continue to push military power, plunging the alliance into a no-exit war over a frozen piece of land? Can Denmark and other NATO countries contain the destruction caused by the US within its own ranks? Russia and China, the mortal enemies, can they sit idly by while the US falters in the current geopolitical situation? All the answers will unfold in today's video. Why are the US and NATO facing the risk of conflict over Greenland? The United States is not only stirring up geopolitical tensions, but also exploiting deep fractures within NATO, leaving the entire world on edge. Greenland, a frozen territory, is becoming a nuclear issue in transatlantic alliance relations. But what has caused the US and NATO, two of the world's dominant forces, to stand on the brink of military conflict? Over an island that could shatter 70 years of unity. Donald Trump did not just make an empty statement when he mentioned Greenland. He firmly asserted, without Greenland, NATO would be weaker, and the US would be stronger. This statement not only shocked the world, but also challenged all the principles of NATO, a military alliance built on the absolute trust that allies would never use force against one another. This was a hard blow to the very foundation of NATO, prompting many to ask, can we still trust an alliance where the leading nation, the US, is willing to violate the sovereignty of a NATO ally just for national gain? Why has Greenland become this ticking time bomb? Simply because its position is a strategic goldmine. Greenland is not just a cold, uninhabited land, but a strategic gateway controlling Arctic sea routes and massive untapped resources. Controlling Greenland would allow the US to unravel every military advantage NATO has been trying to protect. However, Trump's open mention of the possibility of annexing Greenland was not a simple act. The world has never seen such a fierce power struggle. Since Trump said, "The US has the right to control Greenland," an outburst of anger has swept across Europe. Denmark's Prime Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen sternly warned that this is no longer a normal diplomatic debate, but a direct challenge to the existence principles of NATO. This statement was not just a warning, but a historic turning point for a military alliance that the US itself had created. The big question the world is asking is, does the US really want to fracture NATO just for Greenland? Such a move would not only lose the trust of its allies, but also ignite an all-out war within NATO. The matter does not stop at the US becoming an aggressor against a member nation. It places the entire world on high alert. When Denmark's Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen affirmed that this action would lead to the collapse of NATO, he was not exaggerating. This is the harsh reality. The geopolitical map of the world is changing, and the US stands at a crossroads between maintaining a strong alliance with its partners or dismantling it to pursue its own ambitions. This could be a catastrophic turning point for global security policy. NATO cannot withstand more shocks like this. Now, the US is not only threatening Denmark, but also the very survival of NATO, potentially sparking a new Cold War among allies. With Russia and China eyeing supremacy, they would be the only beneficiaries if NATO fractures. The collapse of NATO would not only be a military disaster, but also open opportunities for Russia and China to seize these vital strategic lands. This is clearly the worst-case scenario the US will face. The story of Greenland has gone beyond what we imagined. This is not just a territorial sovereignty dispute, but a global power struggle that could decide the future of the world. The events unfolding in Greenland will shape not only the future of NATO, but also the global security landscape. How have other countries reacted to the tensions between the US and NATO over Greenland? We cannot accept the United States infringing on Denmark's sovereignty, Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen strongly protested when Trump publicly threatened to use force to control Greenland. Greenland belongs to Denmark, and it always will. Any act of invasion will be opposed. These words were not only a firm declaration, but also a wake-up call about a world where powerful nations could disregard international principles if it serves their own interests. Mette Frederiksen was not just speaking about Greenland, but about the fundamental principles of a free and just world. The US is causing an irremediable shock, a historic rift, by blatantly discarding the principle that NATO has built over 70 years. The chairman of the NATO Council could not remain silent. If the US continues with such actions, NATO will no longer be a military alliance. This alliance was built on trust and mutual respect. If one country within NATO can violate the sovereignty of another, we will no longer exist. This warning is not an unreasonable statement, but an undeniable truth about the potential collapse of NATO if the US does not exercise restraint. Not only Denmark and the US, but all of Europe is now facing an existential choice. Countries like France, Germany, and the UK have spoken out strongly. If the US continues to pursue the annexation of Greenland, NATO will no longer be the security foundation for Europe. We will have to seek alternative protection for ourselves. This warning is clearer than ever. NATO cannot continue to exist if the major nations within the alliance cannot reach a consensus on core issues like sovereignty. Europe now faces two choices. One is to continue alongside the US, facing the disintegration of NATO, or the other is to step away and seek new strategic partners. This not only impacts regional stability, but also sends a global shockwave as NATO allies must ask themselves, can they still trust the US, a superpower that once led the entire alliance, when now the US itself is playing the role of invading its allies? What scenario could unfold if the US and NATO clash over Greenland? As the US continues to apply pressure with hard threats, Denmark and other NATO nations have quickly prepared for the possibility of conflict. This is not just a simple military confrontation. It is a strategic war that could decide the security of the Arctic and the global order. European military forces are not sitting idly by as tensions escalate. The UK and Germany, leading a group of NATO countries, have begun deploying military forces to Greenland, sending a strong warning to Washington that Europe will not tolerate any acts of invasion. NATO's Arctic defense system is no longer just a theoretical concept. It has become a real front. The US cannot unilaterally impose control over Greenland without facing a genuine military standoff. Meanwhile, Denmark, though small, is not alone in its fight to protect its sovereignty. The Danish military has been preparing meticulously to deal with any encroachment. The Pituffik Space Base, where US forces have been stationed under a defense agreement since 1951, has now become a hotspot. But US intervention in this area is not merely a change in control, it is a threat to regional stability, and Denmark must carefully consider how to respond. Denmark's special forces are now on high alert, ready to react to escalating situations. Specifically, the Jaeger Corps, trained under the harshest conditions, is ready for reconnaissance and combat in the extreme Arctic environment. The Jaeger forces, with their rigorous training, could be the first line of defense if the US decides to take military action. Denmark's frogmen, known as the Arctic Seals, would also have no hesitation in carrying out covert underwater missions and sabotaging critical maritime routes if Greenland were attacked. Notably, Denmark's Sirius Patrol Dog sled team has been trained to monitor vast areas, traveling thousands of kilometers across the icy terrain to ensure no unauthorized activity occurs. These are not ordinary military forces. They are elite units specially trained to face the greatest challenges of the Arctic. Dog sleds have become essential tools for survival, as no other vehicles can traverse the frozen landscape. Europe is now not only warning, but also acting. A series of military deployments from NATO countries are ready to respond to any invasion. NATO cannot wait until the US acts unilaterally, because if that happens, Greenland will not just be a piece of land, it will become an all-out war. The US cannot enter into conflict with Denmark without serious consequences for itself. Europe will not allow Greenland to fall into American hands without resistance, and they are prepared to retaliate militarily if necessary. The worst-case scenario is that the US and NATO cannot de-escalate their conflict and continue to escalate into a new Cold War, creating a strategic vacuum that will benefit other powers such as Russia and China. Moscow, over the years, has increased its military presence in the Arctic under the pretext of protecting Russia's interests from political developments that could destabilize the region. Russia will not miss this opportunity, as Greenland is not just a seed of instability, but also a leverage point in Russia's geopolitical strategy. China is also not sitting idle while the US and NATO face off. China is pushing for strategic initiatives in the Arctic, not only to improve shipping and access to natural resources, but also to exert influence in this particularly sensitive region. NATO will have no chance once the Arctic becomes a strategic asset in our hands. China is ready to take advantage of this chaos to expand its influence in the Arctic region and new maritime routes, while the US and NATO are consumed by meaningless confrontations. So, if a military confrontation occurs, it would lead to an all-out war between allies, opening the door to a world without NATO. NATO member states will have to decide quickly, as each military option will cause irreversible damage to the parties involved. An event triggering a new Cold War, or even an unwanted nuclear conflict, could completely reshape the world as we know it. Will the Arctic become a dead end for the US and NATO? So, where will the future of Greenland lead? Will it become a new Cold War, or a temporary agreement to avert a global disaster? Only time will answer this question, but the choices made by current powers will shape the fate of the entire world. And Greenland, once an unremarkable land, will become a fateful decision that will determine the global geopolitical landscape. These questions not only open up an uncertain future, but also raise choices that could alter the course of the world. Greenland will not just be a disputed piece of land, but a power transition point in a race where the strong will fight to protect their national interests. While the US seeks to assert control through military power, Russia and China will not just sit back and observe, but will explode in creating changes that could reshape the global power structure. One wrong decision by the US or NATO could completely change the fate not only of Greenland, but of the world order. The US may win a military battle in Greenland, but if they lose NATO's unity, the consequence will be an irreversible all-out war. Meanwhile, China and Russia will emerge as the big winners, not only seizing a strategic land, but also regaining global power from the West. That is why Greenland is no longer just a piece of frozen land, but a high-stakes political game that the world is waiting to see who will win. The most important question right now is not who will seize Greenland, but how will this change the world?